Welcome back to Conversations with Jackie and Bobby. I'm Bobby Angel, one of your hosts, and today I get to be joined with John Bishop. John Bishop worked at Focus in a variety of different positions. He did his doctorate from the Catholic University of America and is pioneering now a new program for men called Forge, and we're going to get into all of that. John, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. God bless Texas, and thanks for having me on this morning, Bobby.
American until Texas secedes.
That's right. Yeah, I'm in Iowa right now. I live in West Des Moines, Iowa. But if Texas ever actually seceded, I did my master's down here. I got a master's at Baylor, and I think I might go with Texas. That's about the only thing that could take me away from Iowa.
Tropical Texas.
That's right.
It's so good that you're here. The blessing of technology is that we get to talk with people around the world via Zoom, Riverside, all the different platforms today. But there's nothing like in-person conversations, so I'm so glad we were able to make this work. Yeah.
I mean, shout out to Texas again. It brought a brother of mine is a graduate student at UT in Austin. So you're just coming back from that trip, and thank you for allowing me to stop through and be on the podcast.
Yeah. So John, walk us through your faith journey. Were you always Catholic? Did you ever wander, leave Christianity? How did you we're going to talk about like masculinity and being a man of God. So I hope this episode is something that can be shared with, brothers, friends, fathers, just people that need to be convicted of the goodness of the masculine heart and what we're looking for.
Yeah.
So starting high level, like your faith story.
Yeah. So, gosh, it's been a little bit since I've done this, but let me give the short version here. And if you have any questions, then we can go from there. When I talk about the journey of my faith, what I often say is that I was blessed next to my own wife, Caitlin, to my own family, my vocation. Perhaps the biggest blessing in my life is that I came from a strong family. So I was born and raised, born in Tampa, Florida, but then raised in West Des Moines, Iowa. I'm one of 6 kids. My mom is a sort of, I guess you could say, revert to the faith. My dad's a convert to the faith. And in our household growing up, our faith was everything. We had a beautiful childhood. So the primary evangelists, the first evangelists of my life were my mom and dad, who did, sure, an imperfect job raising their kids, but nevertheless, an extraordinary job raising their kids, which put me in a strong place when I went to college. Though I wavered in college for sure, where I had always been a bit of a thinking guy, a little bit of an intellectual, and I found myself in college influenced by a lot of great, strong Catholic professors, but also on a bit of a journey. So I found myself reading a lot of philosophy, a lot of skepticism, a lot of what you might call nihilism, Friedrich Nietzsche, Rene Descartes, so on and so forth, and went through a period of time, I guess from start to finish, that period maybe would be a year and a half, 2 years, where I kind of doubted everything, stopped practicing my faith, and became interested in sort of raising the foundations of my own worldview, doubting everything that I could possibly doubt, so as to bring myself to an unbiased position and really get to the truth of the matter.
Very Descartes.
There you go.
Trying to dig yourself to the bottom of the pit.
That's right. And quite literally inspired by him in my own life. I did that, I think, for as long as I could sanely do it. And then, as a friend of mine quipped at the end of my journey, that there really is no view from nowhere, and I became convicted of that fact. Started practicing the faith again late in my junior year of college, early in my senior year, and have really never looked back. It's been the center of my life. Shortly thereafter, I had an incredible priest who taught me how to pray, which was just extraordinary. And yeah, went from there. I did a year in seminary at Mundelein Seminary in Chicago, but have more or less been on the same faith trajectory that I've been on since my junior year of college for the last, it's been, I don't know, like 15 years now, since I got on that track. And it's been the best thing that I've ever done.
Yeah, praise God. It's important to make your faith your own.
Yeah.
As dads,
right?
We lay the foundation, you set the framework, but then respecting every child's free will, every kid's got a different path. And some of that is going to be the stretching and the growing pains and the testing.
Right.
And that takes a variety of forms.
Yeah. Later in this podcast, one of the things that I hope we talk about is, the role of fathers and the powerful voice that they have in raising their own children. And one of the things that my organization does is develop courses, develop materials that empower fathers to lean into that voice that they have. But one of the things that I'm always careful to say is that even if you parent your kids perfectly, right, they still have, the ability to sin, right? The ability to say no. And no matter how, excellent you are as a parent, how virtuous, how smart, how winsome, there's a reality that you are stewards of your kids, and ultimately their fate is up to the Lord, right? There's something in that speaks directly into my own story, that, I left the faith despite the fact that I had extraordinary parents. But another element of it that might be very hopeful to any parents watching, listening to this podcast, you have kids that have fallen away, is that there were seeds that my parents planted that were not easily forgotten, right? So like even when, I remember one weekend in college where I had, engaged in a lot of sinful behavior, that weekend, along the lines that are typically involved on a college campus. I had spent about 36 hours on like a Hindu retreat, doing all kinds of Eastern religious things. On the way back from that retreat, I thought that I'd just go ahead and stop by a prayer service at a mosque, and then found myself back in my college dorm room after a very fruitful and very non-Catholic 4 days. But not too long after that point, I re-entered the faith, and it was new and brilliant and clear in a way that it had never been before, in part because the first evangelists of my life, that is my parents, had planted seeds that grew and that flourished despite the fact that I'd been through a kind of storm in my own life and in my own journey. So parents, don't lose hope. Yep. Whether your kids are away from the faith, for a week, for a year, or for 30 years, there's always hope of them coming back. Now, even if you've planted the seeds imperfectly, which we all do, there's always hope.
Yeah. For me, it was the Eucharist.
Yeah.
I had a time of wandering in college and really wondering, do I really believe this? What do I make of it? And I was checking out different services and different forms of worship, working at the Hillel Jewish Student Center.
That'll do it.
Yeah. I met a bunch of my fellow colleagues at a Modest Yahoo concert.
Okay.
They were like, we didn't know you were Jewish. I was like, I'm not. But the Eucharist was this, and I couldn't even put it to words then, but like, I can't get this anywhere else. That Flannery O'Connor saying, if it's just a symbol, the hell with it.
Right.
And do I really believe this? And do I really believe that Christ wants to feed us with his own body and blood? If that is true, if that's really Jesus, I can't get that anywhere outside of the Catholic Church.
Yeah. I mean, how fitting, being in the Eucharistic revival that we're in right now. I mean, that center existentially, that center of our prayer, that center of our lived experience as Catholics is something which, for all of the beauty that is at play and alive amongst our Protestant brothers and sisters, that touchstone is not there, right? The font of our life. And wow, just the fact of that and the pivotal role that it has played in so many people's experience. Seems like it made a difference for you too.
Yeah. So how did you get involved with Focus?
Yeah. So one of the turning points for me going along in my faith journey in college was that I had a roommate who I came back one evening to my dorm room, and this roommate of mine who went on to become a Focus missionary was sitting with another friend of his who was also a Focus missionary. And they said, look, we want you to go to this conference. And I said, look, I know what you guys are up to. I've heard of this organization. I was in a unique position where I'd actually been, I'd entered college very devout and even started, participation in a Focus Bible study, served as a Focus student leader, and then fell away after that. There was just a lot of unresolved things at the bottom. And anyway, this guy just says to me, hey, yeah, we want you to go to this conference. I said, nope. And he says, well, we'll pay for it for you, and it's in Denver, Colorado. You'll have a great time. And I said, that's awesome, but nope. And he said, well, we'll buy all your booze. And I was like, okay, I'll go. And so I ended up going on that conference. I had a really powerful confession at that conference. And in the wake of the conference, it certainly wasn't daisies. Like I had a powerful confession. I had a series of really long conversations with a kind of philosophically bent person who also attended the conference, and came back at least ready to begin the journey again. So I didn't go to mass even every Sunday when I first got back. It was kind of a 2 steps forward, 17 steps back, 20 steps forward, 5 steps back type of thing. But focus impacted me so that when I, several years later, when I was kind of at a juncture point in my life, it felt very natural to give back to the organization that had meant so much for me. And so then I spent 8 years working for Focus, and that was 8 years very well spent. The organization is extraordinary, both in what it is in itself, but also in this sort of witness, the discipleship, small group way of being that I think it's really played a huge role in ushering into the church more generally. So that was a great training ground to do what I'm doing now.
Well, and to see the growth of the different initiatives which you've had a hand in, to see the growth of Seek every year,
right?
It's expanding. Now all the missionaries who are becoming married, having families, and so it's this new generation of the church that has been formed in very real way by some of these initiatives. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Focus gives a great gift to all of the campuses and the students of those campuses who are affected by the ministry. But sometimes I think among the greatest gifts that Focus provides to the world is its alumni, right? The married couples, one or the other of them in Focus are deeply impacted by Focus, who bring a missional mindset to their marriage and to their communities. So rah Focus, all about the apostolate, and grateful for the work that it has done for the past 25, 26 years in this country.
And then you felt called to pursue your Ph.D.
Yeah.
So I need to call you doctor.
Please do not call me doctor.
I apologize. Dr. John Bishop with me today.
Yeah. No, so the way that it worked for me, I had worked for Focus for just a year and thought that I'd love to go back and get a Ph.D. in theology. And I was really blessed where I received a scholarship from Catholic University of America where they financed the whole doctorate, paid for my living expenses, and was able to dive in pretty unencumbered to studying theology. I never considered myself really a full-time academic, though. So as I was getting ready to leave Focus, I had some conversations with a few folks in leadership who opened the door for me to remain on staff part-time while I was getting that doctorate. So I actually did my PhD in theology while working part-time, full-time for Focus, kind of kept the airwaves hot between Denver and Washington, D.C., and to be able to have one foot firmly planted in ministry while simultaneously doing doctoral level studies in theology was, certainly a lifestyle decision. That was about all I did those years, but also an incredibly, I think, fruitful way to do the theological enterprise. That is, I always had like faces of 20, 21-year-old kids from my Bible studies in mind when I was reading the Fathers of the Church. And I always had a mission field that I was directing my thoughts towards when I was reading Aquinas, or any other Catholic theological figure. So it was a unique place to do theology. And that might even be, if you wouldn't mind, a good segue into what originally got me interested in conversations about masculinity. What happened was I found myself working for Focus, enjoying the work that I was doing with Focus, but troubled by a problem that I saw over and over again, not only in Focus, but in a lot of the different apostolates that were around Catholic University of America. I did some work for Focus, sitting on some committees at the United States Council of Catholic Bishops. And in almost all of the apostolates that I was engaging with, they had a man problem, virtually all of them. There was a scholar that I was reading at the time who put it well. This is not my words, but from Dr. Leon Pottles is his name. Rather unfortunate name for a guy who writes on masculinity, but what do you do? Anyway, this guy, he talks about the Catholic Church, and he says the Catholic Church is a women's organization with a few male officers. He writes that in a book called The Church Impotent. And so it was pretty scathing critique of the Catholic Church, and a lot of the conclusions that he draws, I think, are somewhat off base, but the evidence on which he grounds those conclusions is the evidence.
Yep.
So in your average Catholic Church on any given Sunday in the United States of America, the people in the pews will be 61% female and 39% male. So that is nearly a 2-to-1 ratio, right? Females to males. And I could give you stats, as till the cows come home, about the differences in male to female participation, not just in things like Sunday Mass, but also in Bible study participation, prayer, and really any formal activity of the church. Mm-hmm. That's a problem in the statistics, but also in my lived experience. What I experienced, and I suspect this will resonate with so many of our male and female listeners, was that I encountered, woman after woman, very well-intentioned, very prayerful, very holy, very attractive women in so many of the circles that I was running around the country engaging, who were climbing the ladder of their 20s, 30s, 40s with almost no men, asking them out, pursuing them, going after marriage alongside them. And it just became this heavy, like almost depressing reality for me, that the Catholic Church, Christianity in the Western world in general, has a crisis of men, a crisis of masculinity. And that's a problem on a number of different fronts. But it was for that reason that I said, you know what? I think this is what I want to do in graduate school. I want to study the root causes of this crisis. I want to think about what we might do to make it better, and lean into this topic for several years, which is really how I spent the whole second half of my doctoral studies at Catholic University of America.
So much to jump off of from there. Peter Kraft, Boston philosopher, prolific author.
Extraordinary man.
He's written about this problem too, in that we see such a rise in Islam, for instance, because he writes, Islam has teeth.
That's right.
It's demanding. It has something to offer. And so especially for young men that want like a purpose, there's at least something there that perhaps Christianity has not given them.
That's right.
There was like a muscular Christianity in the 1800s, early 1900s. The stereotypical like mustaches and the singlet bathing suits, like that era of the barbell lifting and whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's given way to a real kind of wishy-washy sense of Jesus and what young man is going to be attracted by that, and especially if like I don't feel like I'm needed.
Right.
The messaging I'm getting is that masculinity is toxic. I'm not needed. I'm not wanted. So I'm just going to check out of society as a whole, including the church and what I might be offered. And it really is like good on you for not just studying it, but having, as you said, a foot in the ministry sense of now what do we do about it?
That's right.
Because we can give stats and we can complain and we can, but what are we going to do? What are we going to do for the young men who are drowning, who are fearful, who feel like life is passing them by, who want that purpose?
Yeah.
And that demanding call of Christ that is not just a bunch of rules, but it's life in abundance.
Yes.
Like, how do we reframe that and give men that today?
Yeah. I mean, this was the question that was so vexing for me as a graduate student and is still motivating in the work that I do today is what can we do for men? Which ultimately is what can, the question, what can we do for humanity, right?
Yep.
I mean, so the John Paul II that probably many of our listeners have heard before, it is only in the duality, the complementarity of the masculine and the feminine that the human finds its fullest realization, John Paul II. And so if we want to help women in this day and age, perhaps one of the best things that we can do is emphasize and prioritize men in our ministry. And that's not chauvinism. The reason we do it is not because men are great, but because men are hurting.
Yeah.
That is, they've kind of been crippled by many elements of the culture, both inside and outside of the church. And it's incumbent upon today's Christians, today's Catholics in particular, to do something for men and kind of show them where to go from here. Okay. One thing that I often say, to kind of introduce this topic is that it's young boys in particular. They have a deep, innate desire to want to be men, right? So you hear this phrase a lot, boys will be boys, okay? And that's true. There's a wildness and a recklessness.
There's a squirreliness.
Yeah, squirreliness is a better term.
To jump off things.
Yeah.
Every stick is a sword.
Right. Yeah. So there's something, biologically in boys that makes them different. I mean, if you don't believe this, just follow the money. So I have two of my brothers and my father are in the insurance business in Des Moines, Iowa. It's like the biggest industry in Des Moines. And look at the male and female insurance rates of like your average 18 through 25-year-old male versus young woman. And you'll see that, yeah, there's a difference in the way that they act, right? And the recklessness that, with which they approach life.
Which is, on the one hand, a healthiness.
Right.
Like the risk taking, the going out.
Right.
There's a good. It's when it's unchanneled, we get into trouble.
Right. And it's the channeling really is what I want to hone in on there. So yeah, there's a phrase, boys will be boys, but there's perhaps a deeper innate desire in all young boys that boys want to be men. And we see that perhaps even more so than we see the recklessness and differences in things like male-female insurance rates. One of the things that I became obsessed with in my graduate studies was the universal prevalence of male initiation rites across time and place in virtually every culture with the exception of contemporary Western culture. Okay. And what you saw, so there was a great philosopher or a great sociologist rather named David Geary who writes a book called Manhood in the Making. Harvard sociologist, not a religious person, but who examines cultures all over the world, looking for those qualities that are common universally to males across cultures. That's a very, very difficult set of qualities to isolate, but what this guy did find is that even if masculinity is to some degree culturally conditioned to some degree and is different, in Papua New Guinea than it is in your, fraternity brothers in the United States of America, those boys in both Papua New Guinea and in England and in Africa and in the United States of America, when they reach a certain age, they're all looking to prove themselves to the men of their culture, to be accepted by the men and the women of their culture, not just as upstanding humans, but specifically as upstanding men. And they long for that. They will do wild things, to ensure that recognition happens. If you need proof for this and you ever want kind of an entertaining 30, 40 minutes online, just like type in initiation rites in cultures around the planet. And you'll see time and time again, not just in fraternities in the United States of America, but in every culture, in every time and place, boys doing things, reckless things, risking their lives so as to prove themselves manly. Mm-hmm. And that desire to be recognized by their culture, by their peers, by their community as men is so deeply ingrained in the male psyche that if we don't channel it, the world will channel it for us, which is why I think when you see things like, unfortunately, certain strains of the Catholic Church today, of Protestant churches today, of our highest, most influential institutions of learning, many of the colleges and universities in this country, the direction that young men need, right? When young men enter college, they're desperately in need of a picture of a good, holy man. They need to know what that looks like, and they need to point themselves towards it. They're not given a picture, they're given a question mark, or worse, an accusing finger. What they need is direction. They're not receiving it, so they go elsewhere to get it. They go, for example, online to figures like Andrew Tate, who, though he, genuinely is toxic in a lot of different ways, is at least giving them a direction, through which they can point their masculinity, direct their masculinity.
Right.
So if we as a church aren't willing to step into the space of providing a picture of masculinity and some channel of cultivating men, then the world will do it for us. The streets will do it for us. God forbid the internet will do it for us.
Yeah. No, totally. And we run to these caricatures of masculinity or femininity.
Right.
It's like every man must fit into this box of hyper,
machismo.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the feminine equivalent, and it's like, no, there's a spectrum, and we can be nuanced and we can recognize, still hold male and female.
Yeah.
as the realities that they are, but give room for that. There's many different expressions of masculinity, of femininity, and Art of Manliness is one of my favorite podcasts, and he's done quite a few episodes on the initiation rites and the lack thereof, and it leads to this, like what used to be you take the boy into the woods and he's got to fight a wolf, and then he comes back and he's a man. There is something to that we have lost, and so it leads to this delayed adolescence. It leads to this questioning of, am I a man?
Yeah.
And men being haunted by this in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s. Maybe they're making a living, maybe providing for a family, but there's still that, I haven't been tested. And whereas womanhood happens biologically,
right?
Through like puberty and everything, all the changes that happen. And masculinity is something that's like needs to be like bestowed almost.
Yeah, it's almost, I think the point that you made.
Correct me if any of this is...
I think you're right on the money. I'm just trying to choose which one of those points is worth highlighting the most. So I'll take two of them. One, there are many sociologists, anthropologists who would very emphatically affirm a claim that you made in passing, that there's a sense in which women are informed by their biology. That is, femininity is informed by biology, guided by biology more than men. So like biology makes femininity, culture makes masculinity. Now we could take a whole hour and unpack what that actually means.
And I'm going to restrain myself.
Right. There's a lot to say there.
We have a lot of space on this memory card.
Yeah.
we'll have you back for part two.
We'll have to pause for a second there. Now, if we were to if I was to highlight another, or at least sort of an outgrowth of that statement, the fact that men are so easily manipulated by their culture, right? Particularly when their culture is sexually saturated, as our culture is today, is actually a point of masculine weakness, right? So it's like, if you want to take down the family, one easy route in today's culture to do so is through culture to sexually manipulate men. And I think that right there is kind of like the pure, undiluted crystal meth of Satan's heresy, is through things like pornography, or just through a sexualized culture to manipulate the minds of men so that they can't be faithful to their wives and or are never interested in getting married in the first place. Right. So another thing that you said, Bobby, that is, I think, equally worthy of note, and before we go further into this conversation on masculinity, is really worth making, that masculinity should not be reduced. Okay, that there are multiple expressions of masculinity that are applicable across professions, across personality types, so on and so forth. And this point, I think, is especially worth making on this podcast. So I suspect a lot of our listeners are Catholics, are church-going people, and in the, for example, Newman centers that I walked around in when I was working in Focus throughout the country, oftentimes you would see a healthy savoring of masculinity and femininity amongst the devout students, but also a reductive vision of masculinity and femininity as well. And one thing that I just want to proclaim from the housetops to parents, to college students, to anyone who is fighting for the cause of the renewal of family life and of sexuality, is to say that masculinity doesn't always look the same from man to man. Like, for example, you may have a son who is a deeply masculine guy and will be a great quarterback on the football team. And then when he gets a little bit older in life, he'll be a great business executive or something like that. And what might be termed the stereotypical American sense of masculinity, he'll be a good, holy man in that way. But he might also be called to be a journalist. Okay, and you might have a son like that who maybe he's a bit more melancholic and artistic in disposition. Well, there's masculinity there as well. And when we give man talks at conferences and celebrate masculinity in Catholic circles, oftentimes we're celebrating figures like Braveheart. And you know what? I love the movie, so of course.
I was just going to put the soundtrack on as you were in the middle of this.
So there's something there. But people sometimes ask me, what's your favorite artistic expression, kind of favorite portrayal of masculinity? There's an old Italian film called Life is Beautiful, and I'd commend it to the listeners here today. If you get a chance to turn it on, it's all in subtitles. It's regularly voted as maybe the top artistic movie made in human history. It's like it wins tons of awards still to this day.
It was one of John Paul II's favorite movies.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So this movie is about the main character in the movie, and I won't spoil the ending of the movie, is an Italian journalist who, in a goofy fashion, pursues a woman that he meets on the streets, marries her, has a child with her. And over the course of the movie, this Jewish journalist, who's kind of like a goofy, funny guy by disposition, basically thwarts the efforts of the Nazis and protects the mind of his child from seeing the horrific things of the Nazis and what they were doing, in the same way that a goofy father in the 21st century will artfully build the culture of his family against all of the threats that seek to assail his family life. And that kind of masculinity, not just the Mel Gibson Braveheart masculinity, is perhaps the kind of masculinity that needs to be developed and cultivated in your son. So for that reason, I think we as parents need to be very careful not to fall prey to the reductive versions of masculinity that actually, this is an interesting point, led us to the very difficult situation that we're in now. So when I was a graduate student, I started reading the figures, the academic figures, who were the first figures really to kind of contribute to this movement to throw masculinity out the window. And there was a figure, for example, named Joseph Pleck, who wrote a book called The Myth of Masculinity in the, I believe like mid-1970s. And in that book, more or less what Joseph Pleck says is the masculinity that I was given as a young boy growing up in 1950s America was a masculinity that celebrated people like John Wayne, but which didn't speak to my own experience of being a man. I found it stress-inducing. I found it causing anxiety in myself. And gosh, it's just bunk. If we only have this reductive version of masculinity, what we should do is we should throw masculinity out altogether, which is exactly what Joseph Pleck called for. And enormous, groups of psychologists, sociologists, academics in general decided to jump on that bandwagon and throw the baby out with the bathwater. We cannot make the same mistake today. Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. There is a reason why God allows even bad things to happen in human history. And perhaps one of the reasons why he has allowed the academy and very influential places of our culture to throw masculinity and femininity out the window is so that we, as parents today, might realize them in all of their complexity anew. So can we realize masculinity and not a reductive version of it when we're raising our sons? It's always something to keep in mind.
Well, and two examples on that come to my mind are the Saints, and we just finished up the Olympics recently.
Right.
And I mean, all different body types.
Yeah.
I would love to just walk around the Olympic Village because you've got track athletes, you've got swimmers, you've got shot putters, you've got ping pong players now, you've got break dancers.
Break dancers is that's what I was going to say.
The skeet shooters, and everyone's an Olympian.
Right.
And same with the Saints. Like, you've got all different temperaments, all different personality types, all different body types.
Yes.
And yet God's glory shines through each of them.
Yes, and there's a way in which the multiplicity of personality types across masculinity are so utterly in the favor of the body of Christ, particularly when it comes to men. Like, one of the things that studies will show over and over again that men do perhaps better than women, at least by disposition, not always and everywhere, but general trends, is that they network really well. And they bow to one another's authority more seamlessly. They form hierarchies to accomplish particular tasks. And depending on what the task is, they will adjust hierarchies on the fly very quickly. Okay, that's one thing that men do very well. So we need men who are both the kind of men who can write a biting piece of literature so as to critique certain parts of our contemporary culture, as much as we need men who can be driving executives in corporate America, as much as we need men who can be affirming psychologists in the space of therapy, as much as we need men who can be incredible teachers, right? And if we don't have different types of arrows in our quiver, we won't be able to build the kingdom of God as adeptly as we otherwise would be.
And in last note to that, even men like Blessed Solanus Casey,
there you go,
who just held the door.
Yes.
Like the servant-hearted who aren't trying to climb the ladder.
Right.
But happy serving in a nameless role.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You think, for example, like the greatest man other than Christ who ever lived was Joseph, right?
Oh, yeah.
Who is noted for his simplicity, right? His silence, and the holiness that comes from there.
Okay, so let's, for the last section here, talk about Forge. Talk about this new initiative you've got going on that is in real time.
Yes.
Like, evolving and emerging.
That's right. Yeah. So about 9 months ago, I founded an organization which we call Forge. And Forge is essentially an organization that fights for the family, but which fights for the family with an emphasis on men. And what that means for the first 2 years of our operations is that we're actually working exclusively with males. What we do at Forge, and by the way, if you want to find out more about it, you can just go to www.myforge.org. That's myforge.org.
We'll put the links in the show notes.
Sounds good. Yeah, so click the links in the show notes. But we fight the battle for the family through men fundamentally on two fronts. So one of the things that we do is we organize small groups. We do men's nights and conferences, things of that nature. But we're also building a national platform through which we can disseminate formative materials for men. And the materials that we put together, the courses specifically that we put together, basically lie at that intersection of masculinity and family life, okay? And what we want to do is build a bridge, a channel, if you will, through which men can take that recklessness, that wildness of their masculine nature and put it in service to the family, okay? The courses that we put together, I'm hopelessly biased, but I think they're world class.
It's okay.
So get online, Bobby. I think you've maybe had a chance to.
You allow me to preview it, and it's slick. It looks great, and you've got a wide breadth of people weighing in.
Yeah,
it's not just this kind of select Catholic bubble.
That's right.
You've got a broad number of professionals weighing in.
Yeah.
On how to, and offering advice on how to help.
Yeah. So at this point, we've had over 50 specialists, not all of them Catholic, though we certainly do teach from a 100% Orthodox Catholic worldview. Over 50 specialists who have weighed in for the courses that we've developed. We've been very blessed with donors where we produce the materials that we put together in such a way that they don't look like they're made in somebody's basement, but they...
Or someone's kitchen.
For a kitchen, you guys, I think it looks pretty sharp.
This area is sharp.
There you go. We decided to put materials together that would help men. And so if you have a men's small group, if you don't have a men's small group, I think you should get a men's small group. Getting support from other men is critical for growth and manhood. We have resources for you, and I'll tell you about a few of them today. So the first course that we put together, again, you could take this as an individual, you could take it as a couple, but it's designed specifically for a men's small group, is a course that answers in a data-driven way this question: how does a man raise a sexually healthy son in the midst of a sexually toxic culture? And here's where the course comes from. I was walking through my public library in West Des Moines, Iowa, conservative state, and noticed that my 2-year-old, who was walking through the children's section of that library, was, being assailed from every side in the month of June by a sexual ideology very foreign, alien to the sexuality that I wanted to steep her in as her parent, as her father. And I thought to myself, gosh, if the LGBTQ agenda, if our contemporary culture is keenly interested in influencing the sexuality of my 2-year-old daughter, then, gosh, what ought I to be doing as her father from a very young age to steep her and then also to steep my sons in a sexual worldview that would actually contribute to their flourishing, right? As someday, hopefully, some of them married men and women, all right? And so what we did is we engaged a group of psychologists. There was an incredible man, Dr. Pat Fagan from the Heritage Foundation, who had spent decades as a marriage and family therapist, founded all boys schools, or at least led all boys schools, and raised 4 sons himself, who served as the primary author for the curriculum. But the way that we develop these curriculum, as you'll see if you jump on and take one of the courses, is that we always have a lot of different voices speaking in. You know, sometimes as a dad, I'm a bookish guy by nature, and I've read a lot of books on parenting, and I'm just like, okay, well, that's your take, that's your take, that's your take. And one of the things that I'm convicted of, both in the enterprise of building curriculum, but even just in my personal life, raising my own kids, is that we need a community of voices, right? We need a community of men to raise our sons, that can be a community that we usher our sons into when they become mature men. So that course is just called Fathers and Sons. We'd encourage you to check it out. We have 2 other courses that will actually come out in close proximity timing to the release of this podcast, that are on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm sure it's very near and dear to the hearts of many of our listeners. And that's, how does a father in particular increase his odds of successfully passing his faith from one generation to the next? Okay. One of the things that I often say is that the crisis of men and masculinity is a problem for this generation, but it's an even bigger problem for the next. Because study after study after study after study shows that the biggest predictor of whether or not a child will one day grow up to be faithful as an adult is the faithfulness of the child's father. At this point, that is an established fact of psychology. What can you do as a man or as a woman? How can you help your husband lean in and use your voice well so as to successfully pass the faith from one generation to the next? And not just from the perspective of my opinion, but what does the established psychology and sociology say are the qualities of those parents, and particularly those fathers, who are successful in passing the faith from one generation to the next? So we have a course called Home Church for Fathers, a play on the domestic church. And then we have a course, it might be a great gift for parents, of people who are listening. We have a course called Patriarchs, which is, if you're a grandfather, what can you do to help pass the faith from one generation to the next? So check them out, www.myforge.org.
I'm so grateful that you're getting after it and you're making this. And it's you and your team that are providing this resource for the church and for families that are out there. John Paul II, I think in Love and Responsibility, as Karol Wojtyła, he wrote, "No word needs more rehabilitation than chastity."
That's right.
Which has gotten such this, again, caricature of repressiveness and rules, and it's all about diminishing versus freedom. And like, authentic chastity is the integration of the sexuality within the human person.
Yes.
So that you can live as the man or woman God's calling you to be. And the same thing, I'd say, like, a word that needs rehabilitation in our culture is patriarchy.
There you go.
I mean, it's the boogeyman of everywhere that very few people can define.
Yes.
It's this catch-all scapegoat. But isn't that the yearning for a healthy patriarchy, a healthy fatherhood?
Yeah. If you've experienced healthy masculinity, healthy fatherhood, then those terms aren't as scary to you, right? As somebody who hasn't. Unfortunately, so many people in our day have not experienced that, right? So that it just highlights the need to bring it back all the more.
Yeah. And again, calling attention, there's wounds and abuses aplenty that lead to this kind of charged, but again, we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. Certainly not denying that there are versions of masculinity in my own life that I've manifested, and certainly in our church communities, certainly in our community at large, that are indeed toxic, right? So I'm a critic of the movement of toxic masculinity insofar as that movement says we should throw out masculinity altogether. But in a way, I am a friend of that movement if it leads to the destruction of versions of masculinity that are actually toxic, right? Mm-hmm. The point is to cultivate healthy masculinity. Now, so Bobby, I'm really passionate about this topic.
Go on.
And I'm really passionate about the listeners that you have on this podcast. My suspicion is that many of your listeners are the kind of people who would really be at the center of my apostolate's demographic, wanting to rehabilitate families and masculinity, so on and so forth. So usually all the courses that we put out there, they're $50. If you click the link in the show notes to this podcast, we're actually gonna give a discount for the next month after the release of this podcast.
Okay.
For anybody who clicks that link, you can get any of our courses at 50% off.
Ooh.
So any course that was $50 is now $25. You can take the course yourself, or they all have gift codes. You can pass them along. The Patriarchs course to your father-in-law, to your father, to your husband, maybe to somebody that you know. So again, for 1 month after the release of this podcast, if you want to jump onto the show notes of this podcast, click the link. It'll take you to a separate page specific to Bobby and Jackie's podcast. Love for you to go ahead and try out these courses for yourself.
Thank you for the generosity.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on.
We'll be sure to put the dates of when that deal starts and ends in the show notes.
There you go.
We could keep going for another
a long
hour
time.
or two, so we probably will after this ends. But you have a flight to catch pretty soon, so
Better jump out.
We're gonna cap it there. Dr. John Bishop, where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, so once again, our website is www.myforge.org. So if you want the discounted, specifically Jackie and Bobby Angel discount for the shows, then or for the courses, then click the link in the podcast notes, and we'll highlight it, so they can easily see what that link is. But if you want to find out more about Forge, jump on our newsletter, learn about course offerings that we have coming out in the next year and to come. Then once again, go to that main website, www.myforge.org. That's myforge.org.
Thank you all for listening. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me again. I really appreciate it.
Till next time. And thank you for the regular listeners. Thank you for our Patreon subscribers. You guys help to keep the show going. And until next time, God bless.
God bless.